Hello, MBAP 516 Organizational Behavior Online students. This is Dr. Jaros back again, this time to conduct a review of the grading of Exam 2, which you took the other night. So let's look at the questions. Number 1, if my boss, the Dean of the College of Business, tells me, a faculty member, to serve on a curriculum committee and reminds me that doing so is part of my job description, what kind of power is he or she trying to exercise over me? Explain. If they later tell me to attend a social event with them that is not part of my job description, am I as likely to comply? Could this request impact future requests to serve on college committees? Explain. Well, this is a multi-part question. Let's look at the first part. Well, in the first case, the dean is exercising legitimate power, which is based on their position within the organization. By reminding me that serving on the committee is part of my job description, the dean is using their authority as my boss to make a formal request that is aligned with my role in the organization. However, if the dean tells me, and some of you got this part a little wrong because you said, if the dean asks me to attend a social event, okay? But that's not what the question said. The dean is telling me to attend a social event, telling me, which is different from asking, okay? If the dean tells me to attend a social event, which is not part of my job description, then I'm not likely to comply. I'm not going to comply on the basis of legitimate authority because he has no legitimate authority to make that demand, right? I may comply on the basis of referent power, okay? But, the question doesn't say anything about that. But, that is possible that I could attend based on, if there's a referent power-based relationship between us of some kind, okay? But I'm clearly less likely to comply because it's not part of my formal job description. Most importantly, could this request impact future requests to serve on college committees? Yes, it could. It could, okay? Because the theory of legitimate power says that when your boss tells you to do things that are not within the purview of their authority, okay, this tends to cause a negative reaction that erodes your respect for that authority, such that in the future, you're less likely to comply with demands or requests or asks that your boss may have of you, even if it is within their legitimate authority, within the purview of your job description and organizational requirements. Because by your boss telling you or asking you to do things that are beyond the scope of your job description, there's a tendency for you to lose respect for them in terms of their legitimate authority. So that was question number 1. All right, let's look at question number 2. Generally speaking, what are phases of evolution and revolution as an organization develops? You do not have to describe specific phases. What impact does an industry's growth rate have on how a company experiences them? Is a manager who is effective in leading a company through one phase necessarily going to be effective leading through a later phase? Explain. All right, again, another 3-part question. Phases of evolution are long periods of time where industry and market conditions are generally placid and stable, allowing for the smooth operation of the firm. However, as described by Greiner, okay, periods of evolution inevitably lead to the development of problems and issues for the organization that result in periods of revolution. Periods of revolution are times of rapid market, industry, and technological upheaval where the organization has to adapt and change strategies quickly in order to survive. Okay, this is something a few of you missed. Some of you told me what a period of evolution was. You told me what a period of revolution was, but you didn't tell me about the linkage between them. How, business developments within a period of evolution inevitably lead to or create problems that result in periods of revolution. They're not separate things. They are linked to each other in that sense. Okay. Second part of the question. Industry growth rate has a critical impact on how companies experience these periods. When an industry is growing slowly, when it's in a mature stage and not growing fast, then the periods of evolution tend to be very long. Very long. The organization has a long period of time where things are placid and stable before there is a revolutionary problem that develops. However, when an industry is rapidly growing, okay, then the periods of evolution tend to be much shorter, because the rapid industry changes quickly create new problems and issues and crises for the organization that it has to face, right? Last but not least, is a manager is effective in leading company through one phase necessarily going to be effective? No, not necessarily. Sometimes they are. Okay, sometimes they are. But remember that, different phases create different kinds of leadership challenges. And a manager may have a skill set that fits one phase, but their skill set may not fit the next phase, right? And a good example of this, and this is the kind of thing I was looking for when I asked you to explain, okay? A manager who is good at delegating, and using a flexible approach to management that involves giving their subordinates a lot of freedom on the job, okay? During, say, the initial entrepreneurial phase, when that kind of leadership is required, may struggle to adapt in later phases of later phases of evolution, when more formal controls and policies and procedures are needed to provide structure to the organization. All right, so now let's turn our attention to question 3. Research shows that managers may have 3 kinds of motivational bases. Describe them, and describe how they rank in terms of sense of responsibility, organizational clarity, and team spirit. Why is the best type of manager best? Well, the 3 bases, motivational bases, are need for affiliation, which means, the desire to be liked by other people. Need for power, which means the desire to be in charge and exercise authority over other people. And the need for achievement, which is the desire to, set high performance standards and attempt to reach them. Okay? These combine to produce 3 different kinds of managers, as described by research. Affiliative managers, these are managers whose need for affiliation is greater than their need for power. Okay? Personal power managers, these are managers whose need for power is greater than need for affiliation, but a personality characteristic called inhibition, which means basically self-control, is low. Okay, is low in these personal power managers. And then lastly, institutional managers. Institutional managers, like personal power managers, have a high need for power that's greater than their need for affiliation. Okay, but their inhibition level is high, meaning they have a lot of self-control. All right? So these are the kinds of managers that emerge. Now, how do they rate in terms of subordinate perceptions of sense of responsibility, organizational clarity, and team spirit? Well, it turns out that of those 3 kinds of managers, the ones that are high in affiliation, meaning the affiliative managers, they score the worst of all three kinds of managers on all three of those dimensions. Their subordinates report the lowest sense of responsibility for them, the lowest sense of team spirit, and the lowest sense of organizational clarity, right? They score last on all three. Institutional managers score best on sense of responsibility and organizational clarity, and institutional managers and personal power managers, right, score the best. They tie, okay? They tie when it comes to producing team spirit, okay? So what this means is, this is the third part of the question, the best type of man, why is the best type of manager best? Well, it's the institutional manager who's best, the one with the high need for power, low need for affiliation, but also a high need for inhibition, right? They are best because they focus on using their power for the betterment of the organization. Their need for power is focused on getting things done for the organization and making their subordinates better at their jobs. Okay. In contrast, managers who have the affiliative managers, they score lowest because their goal is to be liked by others. Okay, not to necessarily perform at a high level. And the personal power managers, yes, they also are driven by this need for power, which is critical for managerial success, but their low inhibition means they often have a focus that's more about, using power to make themselves better off rather than necessarily make the organization better off. So institutional managers are best. And the reason they are best is, yes, they have that drive to use power, which is critical for a manager since managerial positions are by nature power positions, right? And because of that high inhibition, they're oriented towards doing it in a way to make their subordinates better, themselves better, and the organization better. It's not for personal ego gratification. All right, finally, let's take a look at question number 4. What are the steps an organization can take to strengthen their decision-making processes? Now, I got a variety of answers here. Some of you, a decent percentage of you nailed this question. It's clear you read the article thoroughly and, were prepared. But I also got a lot of answers that seemed, like people were just talking off the cuff, like providing their own personal opinions about this, not really focused on what the research articles were talking about. But anyway, let's look at the answer. Well, according to the research presented in the article we covered, to strengthen decision-making processes, organizations can take 3 specific steps, right? First, it helps if they inject fresh experience or analysis into the decision-making processes that their leaders are involved in, okay? Exposing leaders to information they may not have access to can challenge existing biases and broadening perspectives. For example, in the article, one organization hired outside consultants to provide an outside perspective to their leader on a problem that the leader had to address. Or, bringing in financial analysts from outside the organization to present to the leader, financial information that they may not have been privy to, right? Second, introducing further debate and discussion into decision-making processes ensures that, the issue that is being addressed is critically examined from multiple angles, right? So, for example, in the article, Grunwald set up a steering committee to ensure that his reasoning was being properly debated. In other words, leaders create steering committees, or sometimes they appoint someone to be a devil's advocate, right, whose job is to challenge the leader's logic and thinking as they reason their way towards a decision, right? And finally, imposing stronger governance on leaders can, act as a check or a balance when they might be making a questionable decision. For example, having an important decision reviewed by a board, by the board of directors, for example, or some type of committee that has been set up to review leader decisions can provide oversight and accountability, right? So, I was, with this question, I was not looking for just kind of, personal opinions there. We read articles where there was, specific steps that were described that organizations can take, and that's what I was looking for. Anyway, as in the case of exam 1, I hope this explanation was helpful to you in terms of understanding, how your exam was graded. And we'll do the same thing for exam 3.